In this video, we're going to look at transpiration, which is the movement of water through the roots and then up to the leaves. Here is the specification. So you can see it's in module 3 and it's part 4.2, mass transport in plants. You need to know about the xylem and the phloem, but the bit we're going to focus on today is about the xylem. So the xylem as a tissue transports water in the stem and the leaves of the plants. We're going to look at cohesion tension theory tomorrow separately. Today we're just going to focus on transpiration. So as we have already seen, plants gain carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So how does carbon dioxide enter plant cells? Well, carbon dioxide diffuses from a high concentration in the atmosphere, and it's high in the atmosphere due to living organisms, for example us, humans, releasing it into the atmosphere as a byproduct of respiration, to a low concentration in the leaf, and it's low in the leaf because it's being used for photosynthesis. It enters the leaf through the stomata. Water enters plant root hair cells, and this is in the roots, and the water enters plant root hair cells by osmosis. It goes from a high water potential in the soil to a lower water potential in the root hair cells. The root hair cells maintain a lower water potential due to actively transporting ions into them from the soil, which lowers the water potential. So the more ions you have, the lower the water potential it is, which means you've got a nice low water potential maintained in the roots because of the active transport of ions into the root hair cell. So first of all, let's go through a few definitions that you must know to be able to understand transpiration and to be able to identify differences between the xylem and the phloem, and to be able to understand how sugars can be transported around plants. And all these terms are important for when you're reading any literature involved around transpiration. So, first word is humidity. We all know humidity from maybe the weather reports or when you go on holiday, or if you're anything like me, your hair goes frizzy when it's humid. But humidity actually just means the amount of water vapour in the air. If you have sieve tube elements, the sieve tube elements are columns of living cells in the stem that transport sugars up and down the stem. As we talked about yesterday, your xylem vessel elements are columns of dead cells, which are thick and strengthened cellulose cell walls with a hollow lumen, and they transport water from the roots to the shoots and the leaves. We also talked about the fact that in the sides of the xylem vessel elements, you have lignin, so it's that waterproofing material that allows the water to travel up the xylem vessel elements. Translocation is the movement of food substances, which are sugars, up and down stems to growing and storage tissues. Diffusion is the random movement of particles from a high to a low concentration. The stomata are the pores on the leaves of plants which allow gas exchange with the environment. They are found on the lower epidermis of the leaf. They can open or close depending on conditions, and they're also open and closed by cells called guard cells. Evaporation is when a liquid is turned into a gas. This is how water leaves the plant via the stomata in the leaves. And lastly, you have your transpiration stream. The transpiration stream refers to movement of water and minerals from the roots to the shoot and the leaves. So let's have a look at the root, and let's have a look specifically at how water moves from the soil into the xylem vessel. So first of all, a root looks like this, and you can see that roots are covered with root hairs to increase their surface area, and the root hairs are formed by those root hair cells that have that long hair-like projection to increase the surface area for uptake of water and ions. So here is a diagram of a root, and you can see the root hairs are there and they are pointing out into the soil. You can also see you've got your xylem in the middle in the cross shape, and you've got your phloem filling in the gaps between that cross. This is all within your stele. You've got your apical meristem where cell growth is occurring, and you can also see the layers of your root with your cortex just under your epidermis and then your endodermis just below that. Water moves from the soil to the xylem, which is right at the centre of the root, and it does this by moving down a water potential gradient. This is because there is a really high water potential in the soil compared to in the xylem, and this is because of the ions that are pumped into the roots via the root hair cells and active transport, keeping the water potential low, so it moves from that high water potential to the low water potential in the xylem. Here you go. So if you look against this cross section of this microscope image, you can see that it moves across the epidermis, the cortex, into the stele and into the xylem. So this is a cross-section of a root in diagram form. So let's label it and see what each part is. At the end here, you've got your xylem vessel. This is a root hair cell. You can see that with the hair-like projection sticking out into your soil. This is your cortex. Here is your endodermis. These are your plasmodesmata, which are gaps in the cell wall which allow substances to pass between your cells. You've got a substance called suberin, which is a waterproofing substance in the cell walls of the endodermis, and this suberin allows for a waterproof strip called the Casparian strip to be formed, and we'll talk about what the purpose of that is in a moment. So, water can travel from the soil to the xylem in one of three ways. The first way is via the apoplast pathway, which is through the cell walls. This is shown by the maroon coloured top arrow. You can see that the water is passing from the soil, through the cell wall of the root hair cell, through the cell wall of the cortex cell, and then to the endodermis. But because the endodermis has that substance suberin, forming your Casparian strip, this waterproofs it, so it does not allow for the water to pass through the cell wall because of that Casparian strip. Instead, it has to be pushed through the plasma membrane into the cytoplasm to then be able to move into the xylem. And the purpose for this is if it's been travelling through by the apoplast pathway, it hasn't yet met a selectively permeable cell membrane. This means that anything could be going through those cells which could be detrimental to the plant as a whole if it reaches the xylem. So an example of this could be a heavy metal such as lead or weed killers. Water can also travel into the xylem via the symplast pathway, where it goes through your cytoplasm, and you can see that it also moves through your plasmodesmata between cells there. And finally, it can go through your vacuolar pathway, in which it moves through your vacuoles, and again you can see that it moves through your plasmodesmata. And all pathways go from the soil into the xylem. So let's talk a little bit more about the Casparian strip. So when water moves from the soil to the xylem by the apoplast pathway, it never crosses through a plasma membrane. So this means the plant has absolutely no control over what enters the xylem. So again, it could be a weed killer or heavy metal ions such as lead. The Casparian strip exists to prevent this problem. So your endodermis cells secrete a waxy substance called suberin onto their cells' walls. These waterproof cells form the Casparian strip. When substances moving the apoplast pathway arrive at the endodermis, they are blocked and forced across the selectively permeable plasma membrane. Therefore, the Casparian strip allows a plant to select or control what enters the xylem, so nothing harmful can be taken up to the rest of the plant. So that was our first part of transpiration. We're going to look at cohesion tension theory tomorrow. Make sure that you know what the different pathways are, make sure you know about the Casparian strip and the apoplast pathway, and always remember to talk about going down a water potential gradient when you were talking about osmosis. I hope this helps, and if you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to ask during the lesson.